Xi Jinping's method so far has always been, you want to give me a hard time? I'll give you twice as hard a time.
Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. It's an audio version of what you can find on public television, where I analyze global topics, sit down with big guests, and make use of little puppets. This week, I sit down with three experts with three very unique perspectives on China. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, understands the value of surface, safety, and stability in today's uncertain world. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
Senator Chris Coons from Delaware. Great to be with you, Chris.
Thanks, Ian. Great to be on with you.
So let me start with global trade. And, we have this environment where the U.S. and China are trading spars. You've been pretty concerned about what the Chinese are doing internationally. How on track do you think Trump is with his criticisms right now?
He may be on target, but he's certainly not on track. So I've publicly commended President Trump for making a very high priority of his foreign policy, challenging China's mercantilist policies, the ways in which they compel technology transfer or simply steal intellectual property or limit access to the Chinese market. Frankly, ways in which they just haven't followed WTO rules and haven't followed the understanding of modern, open international markets and commerce. But the ways in which President Trump has chosen to challenge the Chinese with a tariff war started off badly and have gotten worse by slapping national security justified tariffs on close allies like Canada or Sweden or South Africa or Germany, just to pick four countries who've complained.
Canada a national security threat?
Canada is not a national security threat, and they don't think they're a national security threat. In fact, they oddly think they've been our closest, most reliable ally right behind the Brits in virtually every conflict we've ever been a part of. So I think when walking into a conflict, you don't start by smacking your best friends and then head in. That was a big misstep, and I think President Trump would be well advised to take a step back and say, we're going to focus on China and their practices, and we're not going to focus on harming our European allies, our Asian allies, our Western Hemisphere allies.
What should we be doing with China now? How should we be effectively pressing them given the challenges that you are very seriously concerned about?
First, one of the things I worked closely with my Republican colleagues here and the administration on was getting the BUILD Act passed and signed into law. This gives us a new tool in our toolkit, a development finance institution that's double the size of OPIC and capable of doing broader and bigger things than OPIC has been able to do in the last 40 years.
So some response to One Belt, One Road
Some response
from China.
to One Belt, One Road, some response that, if effectively deployed over the next year, allows us to show up in 2 dozen countries and say, we're here, we're engaged, we're going to channel, we're going to facilitate U.S. private capital into much larger projects than we've been engaging in before. That's an important pushback. Second, we need to be having real conversations.
Play some offense, basically.
Play some offense.
Okay.
We also need to look at TPP. We need to look at what it means for there to be a table that we helped build and shape with an empty chair at the end. And whether there is some scenario under which it's in our interest, in our workers' interest, in our economy's interest, but also helps reunite our allies around the Pacific Rim by re-engaging with a new TPP.
Now, you put a letter in on specifically to the Secretary of State on the massive footprint that China's developing in the Horn of Africa, the base in Djibouti. I haven't heard anything yet in terms of American military presence. Trump spending more on defense, wisely, represents pushback, smart thing for Americans to do?
Your question is, does it represent a wise investment for us to spend more in defense, or are we doing enough in the Horn?
Wise, in terms of the Chinese are obviously doing a lot more. They're now talking about a third aircraft carrier as well. I'm more talking about the Horn because I know it's something, you're raising an alarm that's saying, hey, the Chinese militarily are suddenly flexing.
Yes.
How do you think the Americans should respond? How are we responding?
We should respond by investing in alliances and partnerships and by strengthening and modernizing weapons platforms and systems to deal with the security situation we're likely to be in. The South China Sea, the growing Chinese Blue Water Navy are areas where we are likely to face significant threats that without modernization, both of our Navy and of a number of our other operational capabilities, we're not really adequately prepared for. We need to present an alternative to an approach, One Belt, One Road, through which the Chinese are gaining access to or control over or almost literally ownership of key strategic deep water ports, from Djibouti to Sri Lanka, really all across the Indo-Pacific.
Where the Chinese are doing an awful lot in all these places. Yeah.
If we're going to challenge the framework that they're presenting, we need to come with a stronger and better argument.
So far, what I've heard is a lot of talk about carrots, a lot of talk about U.S. strategy, to the extent that there needs to be stick in the American, arsenal with the Chinese. What do you think the largest and most effective stick should be?
If we have an alternative, values-based, international order, where trade and access to trade requires openness, that's the best alternative, I think. So there are challenges in the WTO that we could be more aggressive at bringing. There are challenges based on values that are important. If we continue to engage in relationships such as has been the case with the Saudis, the Khashoggi incident was a pretty critical turning point for us. If we only look at our relationships internationally in terms of transactions and not in terms of values and transactions, then we look more and more like the Chinese in terms of how we interact with the developing world, how we interact with our close allies. I think it's important that we have a values proposition that's different than the Chinese. The Chinese come to heads of state and say, we're not going to ask difficult questions, non-interference in your domestic affairs. We're not going to press you about free press, about human rights, about politically open systems. There's a lot of things that are difficult that we're just not going to raise. And they point to us and say, those guys, however, will interfere in your internal affairs. We have a different view, which is that what we stand for has been codified in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights and actually is the best path forward towards all countries to be free and fair and open. And that has attracted allies to support the United States over 70 years.
Chris Coons, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.
Kaya Jin.
Hi,
At the end. Kaya Jin, professor at London School of Economics. Wonderful to be with you.
Thanks, Ian. Good to see you.
So this is an interesting time to talk about China and the U.S. and the world. How are you feeling right now?
Well, the U.S. and China relationship will probably be the key question of our time, not just this year, not just about trade war, but for a long time to come. Because what we're seeing is not really about just unfair trade practices, but it's about Chinese aspirations. It's about the Chinese development model, and it's, of course, about Chinese technology. So these are deeper, more intractable problems between U.S. and China.
Now, Xi Jinping has talked a lot, the Chinese president, about self-reliance in China, which is a different message than the interdependence, the integration, the harmonization, the globalization that we think about or have thought about when we talk about China's rise over the last 40 years. How should we think about, how should we react to that sort of statement?
Well, guess why he's saying that? Guess what's causing that? It's actually the trade war with the U.S. China now recognizes that this era of interdependence might step back, that China can no longer rely on U.S. technology and much less on the external economy, so on its exports, and therefore has to turn internally to rely on its domestic demand to push up the economy, to drive forth the economy, and also has to rely on its own technology. Because to the Chinese government today, there's no way out. There's no way out of this, the tension between China and the U.S. because China recognizes this is going to stay. The rivalry is to stick around.
Whether or not there's a deal between Trump and Xi Jinping on trade.
That is irrelevant. Mm-hmm. And I can almost be sure that China's very much ready to make concessions on the trade deals. That's simple for China. China's ready to pay some cost, bear some burden to uphold this multilateralism, to give Trump a little bit what he wants. The most important thing to recognize
You said to satisfy Trump's ego.
Well, there's a purpose to that, because what is that purpose? Xi Jinping's most important, let's say Xi's priority is to avoid any kind of subversive forces in China or outside China. So that means domestic economic and social stability, and also avoiding an outright collision with the U.S. So if on trade, China can make some concessions and it's not a big deal for China, then they will do it. And in fact, you point out something very correct, which is this is actually going to make China stronger. Pressure from the U.S. will make China stronger in the long term because it's relying more on consumption rather than exports. That all these efforts, endeavors going to innovation and resources now allocated to innovation has picked up in the last few months because, again, China, there's no way out. This reminds us of China joining the WTO in 2001. A lot of those state-owned enterprise reforms, other kind of reforms were long delayed, but it was external pressure that pushed them forward.
But in that case, the external pressure on China was largely constructive to integrate them more with the international system. In this case, you're saying the external pressure is not to integrate China more. It's actually to make the Chinese more self-standing, more independent.
It's not a good thing necessarily for the world, but
you think
it
it's
is
good for China to be more independent rather than more interdependent?
More that reforms that Xi Jinping has laid out in the last few years have been long delayed. And it's because there's a lot of political infighting over these reforms. And now there's a kind of a united political front to push these reforms because China thinks there's no way out. So a lot of these reforms about, opening up financial services, which is already happening, that's also good for the world. So some of it is about integration, lowering tariffs so that consumers can enjoy French wine and American cars, a wider variety of consumer goods. This is good for China. Enforcing intellectual property protection, that's good for China, also good for the world, because China recognizes that it has to go into a new phase of development, which is no longer based on a manufacturing powerhouse, but on innovation and efficiency. So these are all good things for China in the long run.
So those reforms that you're talking about, reducing tariffs, opening up the financial sector, respecting intellectual property, clearly, if they were to come about, I think everyone would agree those would be considered positive steps for both China and for the world. So, in that regard, you seem to be saying that the pressure that's coming from the Trump administration is actually objectively a welcome development.
The trade war, in my opinion, is a strategic gift for China for those reasons. But what you're right about is, in many aspects, is also pushing China to strive for self-sufficiency on the technology front. And it would make it be more prepared to be more independent in the global supply chain and global trade, which is not necessarily a good thing. But on the other aspects, it's just that reforms are being pushed through.
Okay, Jen, thank you very much.
Thanks to be here.
Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, great to be with you.
Dr. Bremmer.
Yes, indeed.
How's life?
Life is good, but China's interesting. If you were kind of looking at all of the constellation of difficulties that Xi Jinping is presently facing, how would you rank them? What would you tell people to say, here's what I'd really be paying attention to?
In terms of the pressures, I put them into three boxes. Number one, the trade-related box, but with one twist. There's a criticism of the administration in Beijing that they didn't get their analysis of how serious Trump was right. But secondly, they also thought Europe would stay on their side and not rejoin the American side. So the critique of Xi will be the analysis of American strategy has not been accurate. Then there's a second box, which is, have you, Xi Jinping, gone too far out there in provoking the United States and the collective West more generally? For example, China 2025, the manufacturing strategy.
Made in China.
Made in China, One Belt, One Road. In recent times, South China Sea. In other words, have you been poking the bear too much? The bear here being the United States. And so historically, Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin adhered to a different strategy, which was hide your strength, bide your time. In other words, let's not talk about what we might be thinking of doing in the world until we've got all our ducks in a row. Whereas Xi Jinping abandoned that strategy. So there is a debate about that, which is bringing pressure to bear. And the final box is a lot of chatter in the Chinese Twitterverse equivalent on Weibo and elsewhere, comes and goes, disappears quickly, about the cult of personality. That is the critique that there is too much of Xi Jinping as the dominant leader in Chinese politics, more so than at any time since Mao. Now, we don't know which way Xi Jinping is going to react. He can double down and treble down. Xi Jinping's method so far has always been, you want to give me a hard time? I'll give you twice as hard a time.
Your gut tells you that's what's going to happen this time?
I can only base it on his behaviour so far. But this is probably the most pressure he's faced since 2012 when he took over.
How far do you think the Chinese government presently thinks in terms of a global role? How much of the world they want to be able to determine?
Well, those are two different questions. I mean, I think if you look carefully at what Xi Jinping has said, the very significant change in Chinese language is this. 5 or 6 years ago, China was going to participate in the reform of the global system. Chinese word is 参加. Then a few years on, China would help guide the reform of the global system. 引导 is the Chinese verb. 2 months ago, it became China will lead the reform of the global system, 领导. This is a very significant linguistic transformation, given that China speaks through these sorts of formulations as a one-party state. So in the global rules-based system, whether it's the WTO, whether it's Human Rights Council in Geneva, whether it's the UN, whether it's the Bretton Woods institutions, don't be surprised, based on that central injunction, that you'll see high levels of Chinese activism in personnel appointments to these institutions, efforts to change the culture, habits and work practices of these various institutions in a manner more compatible with Chinese interests, and where they can get away with it with some rule changes as well. So that has been underway for the last couple of years. On the more hard-edged geopolitical point, which is the core of your question, China's mission is to have a role in wider East Asia where they are capable of singularly influencing events in the direction compatible with China's core national interests, because they see this as their natural strategic hemisphere.
So the Americans must leave at some point.
It's been quite plain from Chinese declaratory policy for decades that they want to see the end of US alliances. They don't see a future for the United States in the region in a geostrategic sense. As for the rest of the world, I think the Chinese template is not that. The Chinese template is to be the indispensable economic partner of the rest of the world, so that when matters arise in other regions of the world or other global councils, there's always this economic lever to pull and saying, hey, by the way, you do know that we're pretty important to you. You wouldn't want to make life too difficult for us. On the security relationship, I think Chinese policy has not yet been challenged in the South China Sea by the United States to any significant extent. It remains to be seen whether there'll be any change on that score. Where Trump, I think, in the China relationship has given China a lot of encouragement has been the periodic outbreak of frustration on his part toward American allies generally in Asia and in Europe.
So if you had to pick Trump or Obama in terms of preferable policy towards China so far, you'd say?
I'd say they dealt in different times and different periods
Yeah, I know.
of the China relationship.
That's terribly diplomatic. No, it sounds like you're saying kind of Trump is surprisingly to you doing a better job on China.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that on the economic relationship, his reaction has been so in your face that it's caused an internal debate to emerge in China whether they have gone too far.
Do you think when you talk about potential backlash, I mean, the stories we, of course, see in the United States are all about China's putting a space base in Argentina. China's got a military base in Djibouti. China's doing massive economic and infrastructure work all over the world. It only seems to be speeding up, not slowing down. Do you think there's any reason to challenge that conventional wisdom yet?
Yeah, because it's a much more ambiguous picture than the one you've just described. Wherever China might be succeeding in, let's call it, the Greater Belt and Road Initiative for all mankind, there are simultaneous failures as well. So the picture is a mixed one. What the United States needs to understand, and others, is there is, however, a grand strategy. It's clear, it's being implemented with partial success. What the Chinese would be quick to say to you in response and to me is there is no American grand strategy.
Kevin Rath, thank you very much.
Good to be with you, Dr. Bremmer.
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week, same place, same time, unless you're watching on social media, in which case it's wherever you happen to be. Don't miss it. In the meantime, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, understands the value of surface, safety, and stability in today's uncertain world. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.